Welcome back to This is a Commander channel, where this is a Commander channel, and today I'm going to talk about Commander, Tough Rules, and Cool Interactions, episode 82. Today's episode is part 2 in taking a look at the steps to casting a spell. The link for part 1 is down in the video's description below if you missed it, but today's episode is going to continue to look at the mana side of casting the spell. So let's get straight into it. The previous episode covered how we must activate mana costs before making payments, but this episode is going to cover a step in casting the spell before we ever activate mana abilities and make payments. We will find this step in the comprehensive rules in section 601.2f, and it's a whole lot of text, so here we go. The player determines the total cost of the spell. Usually this is just the mana cost. Some spells have additional or alternative costs. Some effects may increase or reduce the cost to pay, or may provide other alternative costs. Costs may include paying mana, tapping permanents, sacrificing permanents, discarding cards, and so on. The total cost is the mana cost or alternative cost, as determined in Rule 601.2b, plus all traditional costs and cost increases, and minus all cost reductions. If multiple cost reductions apply, the player may apply them in any order. If the mana component of the total cost is reduced to nothing by cost reduction effects, it is considered to be 0. It can't be reduced to less than 0. Once the total cost is determined, any effects that directly affect the total cost are applied. Then the resulting total cost becomes locked in. If effects would change the total cost after this time, they have no effect. So that was a whole lot of stuff, but the parts that I want to actually focus on are those last 3 sentences. Once the total cost is determined, any effects that directly affect the total cost are applied, then the resulting total cost becomes locked in. If effects would change the total cost after this time, they have no effect. So what do these last 3 sentences actually mean? Let's answer that with a scenario. One that is often used when discussing 601.2f, and that is with Affinity. Mycosynth Golem is an artifact creature for a whopping 11 mana, but you'll almost never pay that 11 mana because it also has Affinity for artifacts. Affinity is in the Comprehensive Rules 702.41a, and it is defined as a static ability that functions while the spell with Affinity is on the stack. Affinity for blank means this spell costs you 1 generic less to cast for each blank you control. So it's a cost reducer. If you control 11 Ornithopters when you go to cast your Mycosynth Golem, then you can play it for 0 mana. So what is so confusing about this? Just like the previous episode, it can seem so simple and so straightforward in most situations, but this is Magic we're talking about, and there is always a way to make it complicated. Let's say you have 6 treasures out, and that is it. You can cast that same Mycosynth Golem with just those 6 treasures. Some of you might be saying, nuh-uh, because when you sacrifice any of those treasures, the Mycosynth Golem's cost will increase and just counter out the mana that was added when you sacked that treasure. And if we sacrifice those treasures in advance, often referred to as floating the mana, then yes, that would be true. But if we wait to sacrifice those treasures when we're actually in the steps to casting the spell of Mycosynth Golem, then it is possible. The previous episode covered how CR 601.2g is when we must activate mana abilities, and then CR 601.2h is when we make all of our payments. So where does 601.2f fit into all of this? After you've announced that you are casting the Mycosynth Golem, 601.2f is when the Affinity ability on it will look at it and see how many artifacts you control. In this case, we have 6 treasures. And so the game will say that the Golem now only costs you 5 mana to cast. Then we arrive to 601.2g, which is when we will sacrifice 5 of those 6 treasures for their mana. And then finally, in 601.2 is when we will use that 5 mana to pay the cost of the Golem, which is just the 5 generic mana. I do have 2 bonus questions, but before we get to them, I have one other similar scenario to try to help make this all make sense. If you control Skirk Prospector, which is a goblin with the activated ability to sacrifice a goblin in order to add 1 red mana to your mana pool, and then you also control a Goblin Warchief, which is also a goblin, that says goblin spells you cast cost 1 generic mana less to cast. So you go to cast your Krinko Mob Boss, which is a goblin, for 2 red, red. And then you also control 2 mountains. You can tap those 2 mountains and then sacrifice the Warchief for a 3rd red mana to pay for your 4 mana value Krinko, because when you started to cast that Krinko and got to 601.2F, the Warchief was in play, as with its reduction effect, and it reduced the Krinko's cost from 2 red, red to just 1 red, red. Then you got to 601.2G and used your Skirk Prospector's ability to sacrifice your Warchief, and then also you tap those 2 mountains for red mana. And then finally we get to 601.2H when you used that 3 red mana to pay for the Krinko spell that you had already locked in its cost to being just 1 red, red. Okay, time for bonus question number 1. You control a Mycosynth Golem, that dude we talked about before, but now we can mention his other ability in that it gives affinity for artifacts to your other artifact creature spells. You also control 4 of the artifact lands from Mirrodin that each can tap for a single color of mana. You then want to cast your Etched Oracle, which is an artifact creature for 4 generic mana, and it has the ability to remove a +1/+1 counter from it, well 4 of them, to draw cards. But also it has Sunburst, which says that it enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it for each color of mana spent to cast it. Is it possible for you to cast the Oracle in such a way that you get enough counters on it for you to use its ability to draw cards in this given scenario? And then bonus question number 2. You control Phyrexian Altar, which is an artifact with the activated ability to sacrifice a creature to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. You also control a Cathodian, which is an artifact creature that says, when Cathodian dies, you add 3 colorless mana to your mana pool. And finally, you control 3 mountains. You want to cast your commander, Chisgoria Forged Tyrant, which is a dragon for 6 red, 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 but it has affinity for artifacts. So with just these things in play, can you cast your commander? The Phyrexian Altar, the Cathodian, and 3 mountains. Can you cast Chisgoria Forged Tyrant? Anyhow, that's all I've got for today's episode. As always, I hope that all of you have found this video to be entertaining at least, and I hope that a few of you have even learned something about the crazy rules in this great game of Magic. Have a good one. Ta-ta!